Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're jumping into something super exciting, building an interactive sales dashboard in Excel. This dashboard is going to be your one-stop tool for tracking sales performance, spotting trends, and making data-driven decisions in a flash. We'll walk through step by step how to create eye-catching visuals using a map chart to display sales revenue across different regions, a line chart to track profit margins over time, a bar chart to showcase sales revenue per product category, and a column chart to display sales revenue by customer segment. In addition, we'll go through how to plot line charts displaying monthly sales revenue across different years, a donut chart to track the number of sales per sales channel, and a column chart to monitor the number of sales per lead source. But that's not all. We're also going to take it to the next level by adding slicers, which will let you filter your data by year, product category, and region, making your dashboard fully interactive and super intuitive to use. To keep the video concise and packed with value, we fast-forwarded through repetitive steps, so feel free to pause or slow down the video as you practice. Plus, the dataset is attached so you can follow along at your own pace. With that said, grab your computer, hit that subscribe button, and let's dive into creating your very own interactive sales dashboard. Before we start building the dashboard, let me first introduce the sales dataset we'll be working with. It consists of 14 columns and 1,000 rows. The columns include the date of each sale, the name of the sales representative, the product name or category, the quantity sold, and the total sales revenue. You'll also find data on the region and country where the sale took place, any discounts or promotions applied, the cost of goods sold, and the profit margin for each transaction. Additionally, the dataset tracks sales targets or quotas for each rep, the sales channel used, the lead source, and the customer segment for each sale. Our dataset is clean, with no empty or duplicate rows, so we'll move on to format the data as a table. We need to format the data as a table to ensure that any new data added will automatically update in the pivot table without needing to manually adjust the data range. So to do this, we'll press the keyboard shortcut key Ctrl-T simultaneously. As we can see, Excel has automatically detected the table range, and since this table has headers, we'll simply click OK to confirm. Next, we'll name this table as Dataset in the Table Name field under the Table Design tab. With that completed, we are now ready to create our pivot tables. So, in the Table Design tab, we will click on Summarize with Pivot Table. It has correctly identified our table range, and since we want to place the pivot table on a new worksheet, we will click OK. We will proceed to rename the worksheet. We are now ready to create our pivot tables. The first pivot table we will create will show sales revenue by product category. So in the Pivot Table Fields pane, we'll drag the product name or category to the Rows area and place sales revenue in the Values area. We will use a bar chart to visualize the sales revenue by product category. So to do this, we'll navigate to the Pivot Table Analyze tab and click on Pivot Chart. We will go ahead and select Bar, then click OK. Let's proceed with some formatting. First, we don't need any of the field buttons since we will be using slicers in our dashboard. To remove them from the chart, we'll right-click on any of the field buttons and select Hide All Field Buttons. Next, we'll remove the title and legend. We'll create titles for all the charts in our dashboard later, and we won't need a legend since they all belong to the same category. Also, we will proceed to remove the grid lines. Additionally, we will remove the horizontal axis and use data labels instead. Finally, we will sort this data so that the highest values appear at the top, making it easy to quickly identify the top performing product categories. With that done, we are now ready to create our second pivot table. To ensure that all our pivot tables and charts share the same source data, we will simply copy and paste the first pivot table. For this second pivot table, we want to analyze the sales revenue by customer segment. So, in the pivot table fields pane, we will remove the product name or category from the rows area and place customer segment in that space instead. We will use a column chart to visualize the sales revenue by customer segment. So, just like we did earlier, we will go ahead and select the pivot chart. Next, we will apply the same formatting that we used for the first pivot chart. With that completed, we will move on to create our third pivot table. As we did for the second pivot table, we will simply copy and paste the first pivot table. For the third pivot table, we want to analyze the number of sales orders by lead source. So we'll first remove the product name or category from the rows area and the sales revenue from the values area. Next, we'll drag lead source into both the rows and values fields, as we want to analyze the count of sales per lead source. With that completed, we'll go ahead and create a column chart. We will proceed to format this pivot chart as well, just as we did with the previous ones. Moving forward, we'll simply copy the third pivot table to use as our fourth pivot table. For this pivot table, we want to analyze the count of sales by sales channel. So to do this, we'll first remove lead source from both the rows and values fields, then place sales channel in both the rows and values fields. With that completed, we can now proceed to create our fourth pivot chart. As we did with the others, we'll navigate to the Pivot Table Analyze tab and click on Pivot Chart. For this pivot chart, we'll use a donut chart to analyze the proportions of sales counts by sales channel. To do this, we'll select donut from the pie chart options. For this chart, we'll also remove the field buttons, just like we did for the others. Next, we'll position the legend at the top, and finally, we'll remove the title for now. With that completed, we'll move on to create our fifth pivot table. For this pivot table, we want to analyze the profit margin over time. So first, let's go ahead and copy the third pivot table to use as our fifth pivot table. As I mentioned earlier, we want to analyze the profit margin over time. So to do this, we'll first remove lead source from both the rows and values fields. Next, we'll drag date to the rows field and place profit margin in the values field. Let's go ahead and remove the years, quarters, and date from the rows field, keeping only months since we want to analyze the monthly changes in profit margin. With that completed, we'll move on to plot our pivot chart. We want to visualize the data using a line chart, so we'll go ahead and select line from the pivot chart options. Let's go ahead and remove the field buttons, legend, grid lines, and title from this chart. With that completed, let's move on to formatting the vertical axis. We'll change the minimum from 0 to 1000 to better emphasize the month-to-month differences. Next, we'll move on to creating our sixth pivot table. As with the previous ones, we'll simply copy and paste the fifth pivot table to use as the foundation for the sixth. For this pivot chart, we want to analyze the changes in sales revenue over time. So we will remove profit margin from the values field and replace it with sales revenue. We want to plot these changes in sales revenue categorized by year to compare the year-to-year variations. So to do this, we'll place date again in the columns field. You will notice that the months in the rows field has disappeared. So we will simply drag the months from the columns field back to the rows field. We want our data to be grouped solely by year, so we'll go ahead and remove both the quarters and the date from the columns field. With that completed, we're now ready to plot our pivot chart. we'll use a line chart again to analyze the changes in sales revenue over time. To do this, simply click on Pivot Chart and select the line chart, just as we did for the previous one. Next, we'll remove the field buttons and move the legend to the top. After completing that, we'll adjust the starting point on the vertical axis to emphasize the differences between data points, just as we did for the previous chart. This time, we'll set it to start at 150,000. We'll move on to create our final pivot table for this tutorial. For this pivot table, we want to use a map chart to track sales revenue by geographic locations, allowing us to easily identify which regions generate most of our sales. As we've done with the others, we'll go ahead and copy the fourth pivot table to use as the basis for this final pivot table. Let's remove profit margin from the values field and replace it with sales revenue. Once that's done, we'll remove months from the rows field and replace it with regions or locations and country. We may not be able to plot a map chart with the current format of the pivot table. To fix this, we need to adjust the row labels so that both regions and countries are displayed in separate columns, making the data tabular. So to do this, we'll right-click on Asia or any other cell in the row field. From the pop-up menu, we'll select Field Settings. After selecting Field Settings, we'll start by setting subtotals to none. Then, we'll navigate to the Layout and Print tab. Here, we'll adjust the layout to show item labels in a tabular format by selecting Show Item Labels in Tabular Form. This adjustment will separate regions and countries into their own columns. Additionally, we'll check the Repeat Item Labels option, which ensures that labels are repeated for cases where there are multiple entries under the same region. Once this is done, we can proceed to create our pivot chart. However, it's important to note that we cannot create a map chart directly from a pivot table as it currently stands. To proceed with creating our map chart, we first need to copy pivot table 6 and paste it as values. This step is crucial because Excel does not allow the creation of map charts directly from pivot tables. By pasting it as values, we essentially convert the pivot table into a static data range, which Excel will then interpret as a standard table rather than a pivot table. Once that is complete, we will simply select the copied cells, navigate to the Insert tab, and choose the Map option to plot the selected data using a map chart. Next, we will link the map chart to the pivot table by updating the chart data range. To do this, we will simply right-click on the map chart and choose Select Data from the menu. Next, we'll update the chart data range to match the pivot table, so we'll adjust it to include the range from A43 to C47. Since our pivot tables are all linked to the source data, linking the map chart to the pivot table ensures that the map chart automatically updates whenever the data in the pivot table changes. With that said, we can go ahead and delete the static table as it's no longer needed. Before we start designing our dashboard, let's create some KPIs. As usual, we'll copy pivot table number 6 to use as the basis for our KPIs. First, we'll go ahead and remove region and country from the rows field. We need total sales revenue as a KPI, so we'll leave that in the values field. So next, we'll drag profit margin, quantity sold, sales channel, and sales target into the values field to track these metrics as additional KPIs. We place sales channel in the values field to track the sales count, so we will rename it as count of sales. Next, we want to create a KPI to monitor the percentage of the sales target achieved. To do this, we will divide the total sales revenue in cell A53 by the total sales target in cell E53. We want this figure to be displayed as a percentage, so we'll navigate to the number format options and format it accordingly. Finally, we want to keep track of both the highest selling product category and the region with the highest sales. To find the highest selling product category, we will go to the product category pivot and reference the cell that contains the top selling category. This pivot table is sorted so we know the cell that contains the top selling product category will always be positioned at the bottom of the list. To identify the region with the highest sales, we will need to use a bit more comprehensive and precise approach, as the pivot table displaying sales by region is not sorted. So to do this in cell H53, we will begin by typing an equal sign followed by index and an open parenthesis. Inside the parentheses, we will specify the range of cells from which we want the index function to return the region with the highest sales. For this, we will use the range of cells from A44 to A47. Next, we will use the match function to identify the position of the highest sales figure within the specified range of cells. So we will type match followed by an open parenthesis. We want the match function to return the position of the highest sales figure. To do this, inside the match function, we'll type max, followed by parentheses enclosing the range that contains the sales figures, C44 to C47. Next, we will specify the lookup array, which is the range of cells where we want the match function to search for the maximum value. This will be the same range that contains the sales figures. Finally, we will specify the match type as 0, which instructs the match function to search for an exact match when looking for the lookup value, which in this case is the maximum sales figure. Next, we'll close both the match function and the index function with their respective closing parentheses and press enter. Now that everything is set, we're ready to create and design our dashboard. We'll start by creating a new sheet for the dashboard. With that completed, we'll go ahead and rename the sheet as Dashboard. The first step in building our dashboard is designing the layout. So we'll start by designing the section for our headers and filters. Next, we'll fill the header and filter sections with the dark blue fill color. We'll then proceed to fill the remaining sections of the layout with the light gray fill color. Once that's completed, we'll navigate to the Insert tab, and under Shapes, we'll select Line. We'll proceed to apply some formatting to the line. To do this, we'll right-click on the line and select Format Shape. Let's go ahead and change the line color to white and also increase the width a little bit more. We will use this line to separate the filter and title sections while also enhancing the overall visual appeal. With that complete, we'll return to the Insert tab, and under the Shape section, we'll select the rectangle shape. Next, we'll change the shape's color to white in the Shape Fill section and remove the outline by selecting No Outline under the Outline option. We will proceed to apply some shape effects. Under Shape Effects, we'll navigate to Preset and select Preset 4. We need 4 shapes for our pivot charts, so we will duplicate this shape to create 4 in total. To do this, we will hold down both the Control and Shift keys simultaneously while dragging the shape to duplicate it. Once that is complete, we will proceed to resize the shapes. With that complete, we will move on to designing the title. To do this, we'll go to the Insert tab and select Text Box. Next, we'll change the format of this text box to no fill and no line. With that complete, let's proceed to type the title for our dashboard. Next, we will add a sales snapshot to present a real-time summary of key sales metrics. I already have the text prepared, so I'll go ahead and paste it here. With that complete, we will proceed to copy our pivot charts. We'll start by copying the map and line chart for the profit margin, as these two charts will be placed in the header section. We will change the format of the map chart to no fill and no line as well. Next, we will change the color of the legend to white to enhance its visibility. To ensure the colors in the map chart really stand out, we will adjust the color for the maximum value to a deeper, more vibrant shade. Let's copy and paste the line chart for the profit margin as well. With that complete, let's apply some formatting to this chart. First, we will go to the Design tab and change the chart design to Style 3. Next, we will change the chart area to no fill and no line. Next, we will remove both the vertical and horizontal axes. We also don't want these drop lines, so we will go ahead and remove them. With that complete, let's proceed to copy the remaining pivot charts. We've copied all our pivot charts to the dashboard, and now we're ready to apply some formatting. We'll begin with the sales revenue line chart. First, we'll navigate to the Design tab and change the design to Style 3. We'll also change the chart and plot area to no fill and no line. With that completed, we'll move on to the bar chart for product categories. We'll again navigate to the Design tab and change the design to Style 3. Once that's done, we'll set the chart and plot area to no fill and no line, just like we did for the previous chart. With that completed, we move on to the column chart for customer segments. Similarly, we'll change the design to Style 4 and set the chart and plot area to no fill and no line. We'll apply the same changes to the column chart for lead sources, so we'll quickly move through that step. After that, we'll move on to formatting the donut chart. We'll change the design to Style 10 and set both the chart and plot areas to no fill and no line, just as we did for the other charts. Let's change the color across the charts for a consistent and uniform look. To do this, we will right-click on the chart, select Fill from the pop-up menu, and change the color. We'll make the same changes to the other charts, so we'll quickly move through this step. Next, we will format the numbers that represent our financial figures. Currently, the numbers are too large and lack a currency symbol, making it difficult to identify them as financial figures. To do this, we will go back to the pivot sheet. Next, we will right-click on the cell containing the financial figure in the pivot table and choose Format Cell. Next, we will choose Custom from the category list on the left. Here, we will edit one of the existing codes, specifically the third one on the list, by adding a comma followed by K in quotation marks. What this will do is use K to shorten 1000 as demonstrated. We will also place the $sign in front and then click OK to apply the changes. As demonstrated, the changes have been applied to all cells in the pivot table. Next, we'll fast forward this step to apply the changes to the other pivot tables that contain financial figures. We need to assign distinct names to the pivot tables. To do this, we will navigate to the Pivot Table Analyze tab, and under the Pivot Table Name section, assign a distinct name that allows us to easily identify the pivot table. This will be useful when we create slicers later, as we will need to identify the names of specific pivot tables to link those slicers to the corresponding charts. We will now fast forward this step to assign distinct names to the other pivot tables, just as we did previously. The next thing we want to do is to copy our KPIs to the dashboard, so we will navigate back to the dashboard. Here we will go to the Insert tab and select the text box. To copy our KPI, we will reference the sheet containing the KPI, which in this case is the pivot sheet, along with the specific cell name that holds the KPI we want to copy. Excel typically references the sheet name by default after the equal sign, so all we need to do is add the cell name to it. Let's go ahead and apply some formatting. Once this is done, we will duplicate this to create the KPIs we need to complete our sales snapshot. In our snapshot, we need the following KPIs: total sales revenue, total number of units sold, percentage of target achieved, top selling product, and the region with the highest sales. Just as we did earlier, we will edit the sheet name in the duplicates to reference each specific cell containing the necessary KPIs. If we're unsure at any point, we can always go back to the pivot sheet to verify the specific sheet name. Next, we will change the color to white to enhance visibility. With that done, we'll proceed to duplicate the KPI for the best region. We will then edit the cell reference to point to the cell containing the count of sales in the pivot sheet. With that, we will go ahead and place this in the center of the donut chart. Moving on, we'll navigate to the Insert tab and create a text box. We will use this text box as a label for the profit margin. So with that, we'll proceed to change the format of the text box to no fill and no line. We will also change the font to white for a clearer look. Next, we will duplicate this text box to use as labels for the remaining charts. With that, we will proceed to rename our chart titles with distinct names to ensure it's easy to understand what each one represents. We will go ahead and fast forward through this step. As we near the end of this Excel dashboard tutorial, we move on to the final step, adding slicers. Slicers play a key role in making our dashboard interactive, allowing users to filter data visually and adjust the charts in real time. With that said, in the section we've designated for our slicers, we will go ahead and type the header. Next, we will proceed to insert our slicer. We can do this by selecting Slicer from the Insert tab or by navigating to the Pivot Chart Analyze tab. We want to be able to filter our data by year, product category, and region, so we will go ahead and select slicers for each of those fields. We'll go ahead and change the style of our slicers. We want the year slicer to appear in 2 columns instead of 1, so we will highlight the slicer and under the Columns section in the Slicer tab, change the setting to 2. The slicer for years is displaying items with no data, which we don't want. So let's go ahead and change that. To change that, we will right-click on the slicer and from the pop-up menu, select Slicer Settings. We will then select the option Hide Items with No Data. Let's also go ahead and edit the name of the slicer to simply Year. We will then click OK to apply the changes. Similarly, we will edit the names of the other 2 slicers. There's one final step to enhance the interactivity of our slicers, which is to connect them to the charts. So to do this, we'll right-click on the slicer and select Report Connections. Under Report Connections, there will be a list of pivot tables, and to connect a slicer, we simply check the boxes next to the corresponding pivot tables. So we will go ahead and do that. We will proceed to connect the other 2 slicers to the pivot tables in the same manner as we did for the year slicer. Now when we click on our slicer, the charts will dynamically update to reflect the specific filter we have selected. As we wrap up the final touches on our dashboard, let's go ahead and insert the Excel logo. And with that, we come to the end of this tutorial. Thank you for joining me in this session on creating an interactive Excel dashboard. I hope you found it informative and that you're now ready to implement these techniques in your own projects. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with anyone who could benefit from it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing content like this in the future. We have plenty of exciting tutorials lined up that will enhance your data analysis skills and boost your productivity. See you next time.